Greetings all, this is K.B. Brown, your host and narrator of the Sleeping in Trees audiobook. You've met the crew and are familiar with the setting, so let's dive into the tales. Of all of our adventures, this one might have been the most unintentionally suicidal of all. If they made a Geiger counter that measured idiocy, this story would have that little needle spinning so fast and furiously, the machine would just explode. It would blow up. Sleeping in Trees, Chapter 1, The Point. In the 1960s, the state of Florida was well into an historic and explosive development boom. The population doubled, and then tripled, and then doubled again. North, south, east, and west, builders were in a frenzy of activity to find ways to turn pine scrub, and hopefully the Everglades, into plots of land that would support a 7-Eleven, golf course, patio home, or condominium. People from all over the country, but predominantly from New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Ohio, Minnesota, and Illinois, apparently could not get enough of the numbingly flat landscape, complete lack of culture, and copious amounts of mosquitoes, heat, and humidity. The boredom was occasionally interrupted by news of a new condo tower breaking ground or, much more interesting, a hurricane. These massively destructive storms sure shook things up a bit, with the unique challenge of living for a few days afterward in a swamp-like environment with no electricity, flooded septic tanks, floating islands of furious red ants, and swarming clouds of hungry mosquitoes. Did I mention no running water, or functioning toilets, or refrigeration, or air conditioning? In fairness, South Florida did have sandy beaches and a warm bay flanked by the Atlantic Ocean. One could fish. About 2 miles east of my home was Biscayne Bay. This is where I learned to sail. It was much like a bathtub. Some said it was so shallow, only a few feet deep, that one could walk all the way across it. I was not so sure. I was never able to touch the bottom, nor did I want to, given its bedding of slimy brown seagrass. The land along Biscayne Bay was increasingly falling into the hands of eager developers. Much of it was privately owned, but owners grow old, estates turn over, and land changes hands. One particularly large mass of mud and mangroves ran from Matheson Hammock, an oddly placed beach park and boat launch, all the way south past Gables by the Sea, a development of uninspired, man-made canals that extended out to the bay. On many occasions, Gable by the Sea was our playground, simply because it was a gateway to large expanses of shallows and mudflats at low tide. Sadly for the developers, but to our utter delight, it struggled as a housing development, with mostly undeveloped plots of sandy coral rock awaiting buyers, and the buyers were taking their time. We could do pretty much whatever we pleased, with little concern for interference from just a handful of intrepid residents. We would load our bikes with all kinds of weaponry and spend an entire day on the waterways in the hopes of catching a fish, an alligator, or maybe even a water moccasin. Hope springs eternal. We used fishing rods, bows and arrows, and gigs. A gig is a spear of sorts with trident prongs. It is a ghastly device. Just riding a bike while carrying one presented innumerable opportunities for frightening injuries. Its razor-sharp prongs looked like large, straight fishhooks with menacing barbs. If pierced, the prey would not be returning to its previous lifestyle. Luckily, for that same prey, we were unskilled and quite inept with the gig. We could get the direction generally correct when hurling it, but that was about it. The bows and arrows were equally ineffective with poor technology and ill-conceived design and flimsy materials. The arrow was heavy fiberglass, with a sharp tip and collapsible barbed wires that stuck out from two sides. Like the gig, if it ever hit anything, prying it free would probably destroy the target. It had a heavy nylon line connected to the nock of the arrow that had to be wound tediously around an aluminum spool. The bow itself was low-grade fiberglass and not very powerful. It was a junky contraption, and my guess is that it was moderately effective for only about 10 feet. The fish we stalked were usually submerged 11 feet. Over the years, we also learned that, from many errant shots, that there was some kind of optic property called refraction that made our underwater targets always appear to be a few feet removed from where they actually swam. We would aim patiently, certain to be on the mark, only to again be disappointed when the fish casually watched the arrow slip past as it flipped its tail and leisurely glided away. In the end, only we, the hunters, were really at risk. One Saturday morning, the crew was milling about with the day spread before us and no real plan. Dinkle suggested we camp out. The idea had potential, but where? Increasingly, the woods around our neighborhood were disappearing to new development and a housing sprawl that expanded like a fungus. One wooded spot in particular, with the most incredible vine-encrusted sinkhole, was at risk. We called it the Vine Fort. It was massive, in the assessment of young boys at least, stretching 100 yards across. When we discovered it one day, obscured deep in a wooded area we passed frequently, we speculated that it must have remained hidden for at least 1,000 years or so, given that the vines had completely encased it. We would spend hours of a Saturday racing full speed through the woods along a trail that ended at the rim and leap out into thin air, sailing downward 20 feet into a soft bedding of vines and tumble head over heels to the spongy bottom. Sadly, the day came when the land was sold and the developer filled the hole to the rim with dirt and plopped a bushel of McMansions right on top. I wonder if the proud homeowners realized this. We needed a new destination, a place remote and still undiscovered. Dork hit on the idea of a rather obscure and mysterious place we all just called the Point. Though we knew of it, and a few of us had even seen it from the bay, none of us had actually ever set foot there. That was the only challenge we needed. Decision made. With but a general estimate as to where it actually was, we packed up our sleeping bags, pellet guns, some grub, pilfered cigarettes, Tipperella cigars, a can of off insect repellent, and headed out for a night of camping adventure. Dinkle surprised and amused us all when he wrapped his meager camping supplies in an old plaid shirt and tied it to the end of a stick, just like a hobo. The decision was the easy part. As we would painfully learn, it got harder from there. First of all, just to begin the trek to the Point required a 2-mile bike ride from home. Our bikes were stripped down Schwinn Stingrays, not outfitted to carry anything, and our backpacks weren't the highly crafted items they are today. Lugging our camping gear would be an innovation at best. The actual camping destination, we guessed, was at least another mile of hiking through marsh and mangroves. Our combined knowledge of the Point was that it was a sandy outcropping right on Biscayne Bay, punctuated by a couple of Australian pines. For us, it was a natural setting for our campsite. That was it. All else was speculation and hearsay. With gear somehow lashed down and in tow, an ill-informed but determined group of 6 headed out late that Saturday afternoon. Jungle, Dork, Lobster, Cricket, a hobo, and me. Getting to the trailhead was uneventful. We pedaled along enthusiastically, our adrenal glands pinched, a bit by the uncertainty of the unknown. Silence was frequently broken by crude and offensive verbal assaults. Our caravan of bikes, laden with heavy camping gear, rolling down Old Cutler Road, must have been an odd sight in the 90-degree Saturday afternoon heat. The 1960s predated Gore-Tex and ripstop nylon, so our sleeping bags were heavy cotton with flannel linings and crude metal zippers that perpetually jammed at the worst possible moment. Our tent was heavy canvas. All were well used and smelled of mildew. The term trailhead was a misnomer. It was no more than an unmarked indention in the scrub off the side of Old Cutler, just past Snapper Creek Bridge. No one, certainly no park official, would invite hikers or campers into this impenetrable clutch of bramble and muck. We stashed our bikes in some palmettos, unloaded our gear, and headed into the swampy undergrowth. Immediately, the groaning and cursing began, and the surprises mounted. First, there was an overwhelming stench of sewage, not unlike what we all had experienced when a septic tank occasionally erupted in one of our side yards. This device predated the modern city sewer system and, at least in our neighborhood, was with some regularity backing up. The odor that accompanied such an event was indescribable. Consider ripping open a hot pit, putrid with 1,000 festering rotten eggs. We could not understand how the septic tank service people could begin to even consider such a career. On occasion, we would head out into the yard to watch a septic tank maintenance event, only to run away gagging. The septic tank men would grin and shake their heads. Second, there was barely any trail at all. We began to discuss who or what had actually attempted and failed to cut it out of the impenetrable bramble. Every few hundred yards, the struggling crew was presented with a narrow, mucky drainage ditch directly in our line of travel. In some cases, there was a log or some broken branches across it, making only a suggestion of a bridge, but usually not. The crossings required a variety of approaches and were quite entertaining to those watching from behind. The ones with logs or branches we approached gingerly, slipping and sloshing, often knee-deep in mud, eyes scanning the brown water for lurking snakes. We attempted to leap across those without a bridge, hurling our camping gear first, usually with mixed results. The ditches were inevitably just a bit wider than our leaping ability, so again we were mired in clay-like mud that reeked of rotten eggs. An hour into the slog, and we were very hot, sweaty, and muddied from our waist down. An endless string of curse words flowed freely with every step. But we knew that the point lay somewhere ahead between us and the bay. We were determined to find it and set up camp. Looking skyward occasionally, Lobster and Cricket assured us that we were indeed heading east, and all was well. How they knew this, I am not sure. We struggled forward nonetheless, ushered on by an intense desire to secure our camp. Then, near an 11-year-old's limit of tolerance, after crossing yet another mud-filled ditch, we spotted Biscayne Bay. There it was, stretching to the horizon in the soft afternoon light. Better yet, before us lay the point. 2 tall, wispy Australian pines, stabbed into a small mound of cream-colored sand, marked this special spot in our sleeping quarters for the night. A group cheer went up, spirits soared, and enthusiasm bubbled over. Though elated, we were dog-tired from the challenging hike that none of us had anticipated. Yet there was no time to rest. Every camp requires a campfire, and the light was fading fast. Pitching the tent could wait until later. We were savvy enough to know that a fire needs fuel. Immediately, we set to work gathering loose driftwood and tree branches. Wood and assorted flotsam was everywhere, suggesting this spot was largely untouched. I did, for a fleeting moment, wonder how this could possibly be. The lack of visitors was odd, as such a picturesque campground was rare on the bay. We had a healthy supply of matches, and found that small pieces of plastic and dry pine needles were quite flammable and made excellent kindling. In no time, we had a raging bonfire. There seemed to be no end to the fuel around us to collect and hurl into it. Apart from tree branches, we found all manner of junk and trash that had drifted in from the bay. Cups, bleach bottles, nylon line, lumber, a couple of tires, an old doll with one eye, for sale signs, and an endless supply of styrofoam from the many flimsy coolers that did not survive a day of party boating. It all went into the fire and roared up in an explosive, caustic blaze, easily 8 feet high, adding cumulatively to the existing and overwhelming stench enveloping the area. Somehow, our disorganized crew had managed to pull together an impressive array of victuals. We had hot dogs with buns and yellow mustard, but quickly discovered that roasting one over a mound of burning plastic made it taste like gasoline. There was bologna, American cheese, peanut butter, jelly, bread, chips, and even marshmallows. We also had a stash of Coca-Cola and Pepsi. Cigarettes and tipperillos were in plentiful supply. We feasted and discussed the adventures of the day, capping it all off with an after-dinner smoke. As we settled into our campsite, small stomachs bulging, the blazing sun slowly slid below the mud and mangroves to the west. We felt pretty good about our intrepid endeavor, forging through muck and mire to strike up camp, where clearly very few others had desired to camp before. The usual adolescent insults and rude remarks were traded around as we roasted the last marshmallows, and fleeting wisps of daylight faded across the dusky Biscayne Bay. As if on cue, Jungle sat on Dork's small styrofoam cooler and it exploded. More fuel for the fire. In an instant, Dork was pummeling him as they rolled about in the sand. We all took turns peeing into the bonfire, which added mightily to the stench. An intermittent breeze left quietly with the fading sun, and all grew still. It was to be a calm night. With virtually no warning, out of the swampy mangroves, like nothing before we had ever seen, it surged up from the blackness and descended upon us with unimaginable fury. We were swarmed and enveloped in a black cloud, a thick, dense blanket of stinging, blood-sucking monsters, mosquitoes. Growing up in Miami, we were all well acquainted with the ever-present bastards. In fact, we often enjoyed letting one alight on an arm or leg and puff up full of blood before smashing it flat, just for the fun of it. But this mass attack was like nothing we had ever encountered. We were instantly crazed with the intensity of the swarm. Our first move was to the fire. We all clustered as close as we could against the flames, hoping that the heat and acrid smoke would repel the onslaught. No luck. Nearly asphyxiated from our burning landfill, we were repelled instead. Sensing our vulnerability, the black cloud only seemed more intent on its attack. Thousands of them drove at us with their high-pitched, whining buzz. We dove into our sleeping bags and attempted to zip them up tightly around our heads. Of course they jammed. Within moments, the heat and humidity was suffocating, but the slightest crack for air invited an instant invasion. There was no escape. Finally, on went the off, our final, desperate attempt for protection. It was too late. We couldn't begin to apply the smelly chemical repellent before we were covered with the tireless black plague. They seemed immune to any attempt to fight them off and just kept coming, wave after wave. In just a few miserable minutes, we all realized, with no word spoken, the depressing truth. We were doomed. This night of camping was over. None of us wanted to say it, but we had to go back. Peering into the dark, swampy night, just outside the campfire's rim of light, was almost unsettling enough to numb the sting of 1,000 mosquitoes, but not quite. As we hopped around, cursing and swatting, we seriously discussed the hike back, the way we had come. Without even a single flashlight, we realized it would be a nightmarish journey, and we would be heading right into the swamp that spawned the black swarm that was presently attempting to sting us to death. Not knowing what or who had cut the meager trail we had struggled along a few hours earlier stirred a special terror in our hearts. It was very dark and a long way back. Lobster's creative mind revved into high gear. Spurred into a hyperactive state by the venom of hundreds of stings, he had a small idea, but a kernel of a plan. With a swarm of mosquitoes alighting on his head and face, he put it forth to the desperate, embattled crew. Between us and the end of the road in the familiar Gables by the Sea development was about a half of a mile of open bay. The point abutted a deep channel across which lay shallow water to the road. Though the channel was used by vessels coming and going into the development and others further up Snapper Creek, Lobster noted that it appeared to be a quiet night. In fact, he had witnessed but a single craft heading out through the waterway earlier that afternoon as we hiked out along the imaginary trail. We had planned well. Among the campers, we had the foresight to bring 3 air mattresses, one with a slow leak. In Lobster's view, the decision was an easy one. His rapidly hatched plan had us stacking our gear and our bodies onto the 3 air mattresses. With 6 of us, it would be a double-decker rafting approach to the safety of solid ground and a long hike home. Holding them together by hand, we would launch out into the channel in the dark and paddle across the bay to the safety of the opposite shore. As Lobster laid out his hastily devised strategy, Jungle began to sob. He was terrified of the water, especially at night. He could barely swim. We informed him that the backup plan was certainly his to choose. Hike alone back to the bikes, crossing approximately 7 muddy drainage ditches in the black of night with no light, and meet us back at home. He cried harder. With the black swarm unrelenting, we quickly topped off the air mattresses and pulled together what little was left of our scattered gear. Looking into the black bay, we pondered a few things. The depth of the channel, unknown currents, sharks often feed at night, the odds of a boat motoring right through our unlit flotilla, the likelihood of 3 air mattresses becoming 2 or even 1, the possibility we would become detached, drift apart and be swept into the Atlantic, or simply topple over and drown, weighed down heavily by our sodden camping gear. Among the group, there was some reluctance to move forward, but the stinging swarm ushered us on. The 3 stooges could not have produced a better attempt at our first launch. The overloaded air mattresses immediately split apart. We toppled over, the sleeping bags were submerged instantly, and became massive, sodden drags on any progress. Now sopping wet, Jungle whimpered. Miraculously, we stabilized the haphazard raft in a second attempt and held it together tightly with our inside hands. With our outside hands, we slowly began to paddle. We were afloat. We were moving. The mosquitoes swarmed and stung. We cursed with gusto. Out into the open channel we went, a few feet at a time. It grew quiet and very dark. Our blazing landfill was dying a slow death as it drifted away into the distance. It was our only light. The water below was deep and black. We had no idea what might lurk there. Thankfully, there was not a single boat in sight this night. The waterway was quiet, the breeze fleeting. By a simple stroke of luck, the conditions were almost ideal for a group of misinformed campers escaping the horror of the point on a poorly constructed flotilla. We paddled along with diligence and purpose, intent on getting to shore before our contraption sank or a speeding vessel sliced us in 2. Before long, we broke outside of the channel and were struck by an odd realization. The mosquitoes were gone. Not one remained. When we had paddled away from the point, they had decided to stay. As we celebrated this discovery, Jungle, at this point too terrified of the treacherous waters to even cry, fell overboard. He screamed and thrashed for a few moments, disappeared briefly, and then he stood up. With no light and no sight, little did we know we were only 10 yards from shore in water 2 feet deep. That night ended with the 6 of us each dragging 50-pound, waterlogged flannel and canvas blobs 3 miles down the long road home. They would never be deployed again. Jungle and Dinkle simply abandoned theirs in someone's front yard. Cars passed us en route, and we were sure they wondered what this group of mud-streaked young boys could possibly be about. We all ended up at my house in the wee hours, hot, sweaty, sticky, and quite stinky from the mud and salt water and the long, arduous hike home. We collapsed on the floor in the family room and slept like the dead. The next morning, my mom couldn't begin to know where we had all been, covered in foul-smelling mud and hundreds of mosquito bites. She didn't even ask. She didn't even ask. Without a word, Mom went straight to work in the kitchen, turning out a copious supply of her signature Swedish pancakes, warm and fragrant with creamery butter and strawberry jam slathered inside. The delightful odor wafted through and awoke us all. We were so ravenous, she had to make several batches and fully exhausted her supply of milk and eggs. That was our only attempt to camp at the point. Dork fended off much abuse in the days to follow for suggesting the disastrous idea in the first place. He refused to accept any responsibility. As I raced out of the driveway on my Stingray that Sunday afternoon, refueled and refreshed, I began to understand how the point could be at once so fetching a place, yet sadly one that had to endure such a remote and lonely existence. Coming up is Chapter 2, a very special chapter, and as I wrote it, I was repeatedly reminded just how lucky me and my crew were to have this exceptional person in our lives. It's called Sweet Essie May.